Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and I'm joined by my favorite Raptors writer and my colleague now, which is kind of cool to say, the one and only Michael Grange of Sportsnet. Thanks so much for taking the time, Grange, and coming on this podcast again. I really appreciate it. What's kind of been up in your world this year? How's this season been for you?
It's been, not the most electrifying, I guess, overall. Just you kind of knew what everyone was in for almost from training camp, and then, it was very much a rebuilding season, and then a lot of injuries and a pretty challenging schedule made the rebuild go better in some ways, just because Raptors were able to rack up a lot of losses. But it was so that's not that they were intending to lose, but like the losing wasn't a bad thing. It's kind of it's hard to get all dramatic about that. And ironically, now that they're getting healthy and playing better, and the schedule is a little easier, now the drama is, are they winning too much? So it's kind of an upside down season in that sense.
Where do you stand on almost like the ethical tank and fans? Obviously, you're not a fan, but just seeing them kind of ride the highs and lows, in a sense, the inverse of that, where the highs are the losing and the lows are the winning. Like, what do you make of that for kind of a fan base in a tank trying to kind of comprehend that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a fact of life. Certainly in the NBA, it exists, I think, to a certain extent in other sports, but in the NBA. Your best players are playing 80% of the time. And and they have I think, outside of maybe it's kind of like if you have a great player in the NBA, it's sort of like having an elite starting pitcher every single game or having the very best goalie in hockey. Like it just sort of tips the balance in a way that it's very hard for other teams to compensate. And if you don't have that single player, it's not that you can't win, it's just harder. There's just more things have to go right. And so it's just the fact of the matter is it's very difficult to find players that are that impactful if you don't draft them. There's always exceptions to every rule, but that's generally either you draft them or you use the capital you accumulate through drafting to occasionally trade for them. It's very rare that you sign them. And I think in Toronto, it's even less rare that you would sign one as a free agent. Um, and so, I just think it's part of being in the NBA. It's part of the life cycle of NBA teams. And to me, the right way to do it is to be surgical about it and to be kind of anticipate it and get out ahead of it. And in that context, you can kind of make that transition from hopeless to hope a little faster and a little more efficiently. And that's, I think, where teams sometimes stumble.
Where, like, when you evaluate this tank job by the Raptors, and how would you evaluate?
They call it a rebuild, by the way. It's a
Rebuild,
rebuild.
rebuild. Yeah, exactly. I might just be on Tankathon a lot. That maybe that's where my hairs are getting kind of crossed. But what, I guess, like, how would you assess their rebuild? Like, they have been really banged up, and Grady Dick's had a pretty good season. RJ Barrett, Scottie Barnes, maybe could be more efficient, but he hasn't been bad either. Like, what do you make of just the core so far this season and how they've been playing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I give organizationally, I give them kind of like a B, maybe a B minus in the sense of we've talked about this before. I think they could have got out ahead on this and maybe been at least 1 year further along, had they been, um, like I said, a little bit more proactive in making the transition from the roster they had just 2, 3 years ago. But it wasn't horrible. They didn't drag on too long, and they did make their decisions, and they sort of chose their path last year. Um, and I think really the test for them is going to come in the next 35 games or so, because as I said, it was pretty easy to kind of get yourself in pretty good lottery position. Um, and in the NBA, you don't have to be the very worst team to get the very best pick. You just have to sort of be in that bottom 3, 4, 5 area to have the reasonable chances. And the Raptors kind of got into that without having to kind of lose their dignity, so to speak. Like I said, they were just so injured. But we've seen it in the last kind of 7 games now. The schedule's turned. Their roster's a little healthier. Their veterans are back helping their bench. And they've won 6 out of 7, and they'll probably win tonight against Washington. So that'll be 7 of 8. And they have another winnable game on Friday against Chicago. So and it all of a sudden, the more wins you accumulate, it's not so much that your chances of picking first go down all that much, they do, but your chances of picking 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, they really go up. And and the gap between the talent you're picking at 12th versus 2 is pretty significant in any sport. And so, you look ahead at this schedule and I've always pointed to the last 20 games. They play the Wizards, who they play tonight. They play the Wizards 3 more times. The Wizards are on pace to be maybe the worst team in the NBA in NBA history. They play Charlotte, who are going to be, fighting for one of these lottery positions. They play them twice. They play Utah twice. They play Portland twice. They play. I think there's a Chicago game in there.
Mhm.
Um, I think some 13 of the last 20 games are against teams that will be fighting for lottery position, and that's where it can get really ugly. Like you've got to invent injuries. You've got, Scottie Barnes, his calf is, all of a sudden he has a calf strain, and Jakob Poeltl, his back is stiff. Like it's just sort of you see other teams do it, and if you want to if this is the path you've chosen, you just got to kind of hold your nose and do it sometimes.
When does that start? I know you said, I think on the radio that we're to anticipate some spectacularly corrupt basketball, which I just really found a great quote. But should that start now? Like, they play the Wizards tonight, Chicago. Like, when does that, should they start kind of going all in on everyone having a calf strain?
I think they can probably, they got a couple of things working in their favor. Is after these couple of games I've mentioned, the schedule kind of they end up playing. They've got a tough couple of road trips coming up. They've got the Knicks. They've got, the schedule reverts back to being pretty challenging where they'll generally be not be the favorite in a lot of games coming up. It's just that last 20 games, which is going to be critical. And the way this Raptors team is playing right now, they could go 15-5. And for what would be
Yeah.
the issue. And but I think in their favor is the trade deadline comes up next week. And really, I think the key reasons for this turnaround have been, some of the players that are veteran that are probably the most likely to be traded. And it's, Davion Mitchell's been, really, really been a key part of their defensive resurgence. He's a pending free agent. I don't think he's a long-term fit here with Jamal Shed, kind of showing he's looks like he's going to be a capable, at least backup point guard. Bruce Brown is, he's a good player and he's on an expiring contract, and he's a guy who probably is better suited in a winning situation. Chris Boucher, he's kind of playing some of his best basketball of his career right now, and he's on an expiring contract and could probably help some teams. Kelly Olynyk might be another one. He's got a year left on his deal, but again, he's got some attributes that would be helpful, I think, to teams who
Mm.
are serious about winning right now. So, um, you move those guys from the equation, you replace their minutes with, some interesting young rookies like Jonathan Mobo, Jacoby Walter, more minutes for Jamal Shed. Like that's all great, but those guys are rookies, and they the drop off between what would the performance level in those minutes between the veterans and some of these younger players would be probably enough. You could, it wouldn't be too bad. So that could help them as well.
How likely do you expect all the unrestricted free agents to be members of the Raptors after the deadline? Like, do you think it's going to be a mass exodus? Do you expect it to be here and there? Like, what do you think happens at the trade?
I think I don't think a mass exodus just because the as you probably know, and maybe listeners are familiar, the NBA salary cap or collective bargaining agreement is it's a much more complicated and difficult to maneuver document than it's ever been. I mean, it's always been, a a bit of a brain melt for some people, but it's got only more so every new iteration of it or nuance of it has been aimed at kind of making it more difficult for teams to kind of go over certain thresholds with salary.
Mm.
And so, and so teams that would be more than willing to pay luxury tax amount of dollars and add veterans for a championship run are simply can't. Their hands are tied. And then teams that uh, might be interested and are capable have to kind of look at what every move they make has kind of reverberates in the future regarding, where they might be in terms of luxury tax and first apron, second apron, all these different terms. Um, all of which is to say, in a normal environment or the environment that existed even 3, 4 years ago, I would think all of these guys could probably find a home. I think in this environment, it still could be all, it might be none. And
Mm.
that's not because there's not an interest or a willingness. It's just the logistics of making some of these moves are difficult. If I had to bet, let's just say one out of the four goes and maybe two, but I'd be a little bit surprised if it's more than that.
You had a story a couple, recently about just the untouchables on this team, and you mentioned Scottie Barnes, and obviously Grady Dick has had a really good sophomore season. What does that kind of mean for the rest of the core with like Quickly, RJ? Is it that you expect them to be, this is an off-season kind of play where Masai, Bobby will reevaluate? Is this something that at the deadline, like? What do you just make of kind of their pathway forward with seeing Grady, Dick, and Scottie Barnes as the future, and everyone else kind of we'll see.
Yeah, I think the way to interpret that, or at least the way I interpret it, is if the goal is to be a contender and a championship level team, you're not getting there without turning over this roster. And it doesn't mean that they're not happy with a lot of these guys or they don't see that, you know, that a guy like Manuel quickly, obviously they signed him, they like him. And, you take an RJ Barrett who's having a career year. Um, it's not that they aren't capable players who they can see can help them. It's more how it's just being kind of ruthless about how do you find these players that are impactful enough in all areas that they can, help a team like the Raptors become, not just a playoff team, but a championship contending team. And it's likely not going to happen in a year. It's likely going to be, a multi-year process. And so in that context, the way I would look at that is they kind of see that, there's no question their commitment to Scottie Barnes. That's not going to change anytime soon. I think they see a guy like Grady Dick as sort of an archetype of a player that can fit in a lot of different lineups. And after that, it's kind of like, you know, can we find better? And maybe they can't, right? Like and that's not to say that they're trying and kind of run guys out the door, but it's just a reflection of, this team until this. I think when I wrote that, they hadn't really started this streak, and this team had won 20 games in 12 months. So, why would anyone else be untouchable? And why would anyone be untouchable in that circumstance?
I'm kind of curious just from being around, you've covered this team for a while, you've covered Masai and Bobby for a while. You kind of alluded to it maybe being holding on to guys like Pascal and OG and letting Fred walk to free agency instead of maybe rebuilding and maybe being they could have been more ruthless. Like how has that maybe changed or evolved in the past couple of years in terms of just their kind of ability or the way they see players and maybe be not so attached to them at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's changed all that much. I mean, I think, and in fairness, that's a good point. I mean, I think the side jury kind of acknowledged at one point maybe he had been a little bit too attached. Those guys had helped him win an NBA title, right? And he drafted them. And, they had all delivered well beyond what anyone could have possibly expected of them when they were drafted or signed. And, you're having a parade with them in 2019. Like it's hard not to right be attached.
Yeah.
And they're good players. Like all of those guys were great. You're talking OG, Pascal, and Fred VanVleet. Like they seem to be doing pretty well where they're playing now. So
Yep.
it wasn't like I think the challenge there was, the hope was that those three would find a way to coexist and grow with Scottie Barnes, and in I think the Raptors mindset that Scottie Barnes would kind of be the Kawhi Leonard, let's say, to their supporting cast. And I just think the stage that the other three guys were in their careers and what they were looking for in terms of their contracts, it just made that unfeasible. And, I know the Raptors tried to make it feasible and they couldn't. And I would say and have written that that's where they went wrong is they kind of maybe um kind of believed a little too strongly that they could make it work. And had they been more um, proactive in recognizing that it couldn't or it wasn't going to, they could have got this started sooner. The returns might have been a little better, and but that's all ifs and buts or candies and nuts. I mean, these decisions are not easy.
Yeah. With one of the guys they did get in return for OG was RJ Barrett, and you wrote a wonderful, long feature about him. And obviously he's had such heartbreak and being from Toronto and playing for Canada, and his dad obviously played for Canada as well and at the Olympics. But I'm just curious, maybe I'm gonna put my journalist hat on a little bit and just how does a story like that come together? What's maybe the behind the scenes of kind of bringing a story like that alive, which, obviously you need a lot of dogged and good journalism to kind of bring it to the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I wanted to write about RJ. He had such a great finish to last season. Obviously, he'd been through something deeply traumatic for him and his family and, their whole community with the death of his brother Nathan, kind of a sudden death due to an illness. And I should say death due to a sudden illness, I guess is the right way to put it. And so, I thought RJ would be a good subject for a feature anyway, having been traded and again finishing last season so strong and then so that was fairly obvious or easy decision to make. And then when, parties agreed to kind of provide some access and RJ was going to sit down with me, my goal was not to talk about his brother and kind of dig only into that
Mm.
or primarily into that, just because it felt like such a sensitive and, like I say, a truly traumatic event in somebody's life that was pretty fresh. And so, but that didn't concern me because I've just felt there was enough other stuff to write about with RJ and just in terms of basketball. And, but in sitting down with him, and I'm fortunate to have known RJ for a long time, knew him as a kid, know his dad fairly well. And so I think there was a little bit of comfort. And, I broached the subject because it was present. It's not, it is definitely part of a story. And and it was kind of left it as his choice what he wanted to share and how he wanted to share it. And he was pretty forthcoming about it. And he so it became the question subsequent to that was, okay, well, now what do I do with it? He's kind of shared these details and that are pretty intimate, and it almost created its own problem where if you're going to uh, write about that, you want to make sure you do it right. You want to make sure you do it in the right context. I had, a really long conversation with his dad about, his own experiences and both, both the basketball conversation and also, because RJ had shared it about Nathan as well. And I talked to Rowan before about his son. Um, and so, that gave me a little bit more assurance that, this was not, it was an appropriate time and way maybe
Hmm.
to surface some of this stuff. And then in the writing, I was just very careful, because sometimes when something is so powerful, and then so, it's a fresh grief, right? I think if you just on a technical level, like if that becomes the kind of the spine of your story only, um, it gets really heavy for the reader. It
Hmm.
gets very, um, it kind of overshadows all these other worthy elements to RJ's story.
Hmm.
Um, and and so, it's a matter of delivering this side of it and contextualizing it in a way that is kind of, it's like a chord in a song, right? Like the wrong chord can just, the right chord can make a song can really resonate. And in this case, that's sort of what's going on in my head, is just trying to, okay, well, how to kind of maneuver from A to Z here. And I think based on the feedback from it, it worked well. Um, but even in talking about it, like I still find it, I think it was, I'm very, very happy and proud I did the story. I'm the, the people, the principals involved in the story, the feedback was positive, but I still feel like it was a difficult story for me to do. Just because, it's not for me, it's not entertaining. It's not,
Yeah.
so you kind of hope you did it the best you can.
Maybe like on the court to kind of transition from kind of the heartbreak of RJ, but on the court, it's been, for the most part, like he's taken such a step up. He's become more efficient. It seems like he's thriving in Toronto. What have you just seen being around him, just on the basketball side that has really helped him elevate to kind of play the efficient way that he has so far in his tenure in Toronto?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a big part of the story as well. And his story, the past 12 months is, he would kind of pledge and that this is the player he's always been, and that the ability to fit well with other elite players, to play off the ball, to play kind of have a lighter touch offensively, in terms of his usage and ball dominance, I guess would be would be one way to put it, has always been part of his menu. Just the way things were arranged with the Knicks, it just was not the way they played, and it was not the role they kind of had him slotted for. And, he's proud of how he played there. And it was interesting to talk to people in New York. Like he did a good job for that team. Um, but, it kind of created an image of him as, a kind of a head down gunner kind of guy. And so it was, to, in some eyes, it was almost a revelation where all of a sudden he's backdooring people, and, he's putting up these 10 assist games, and having really, really effective games, shooting the ball 10, 12, 13 times. That hadn't been something he'd really demonstrated. And so on one level, it's a great improvement. It certainly has opened people's eyes to him as a player, but he would say that, this has always been there. So I think what's been really interesting is now, as the team's a little bit more healthy, is, he's been able to stay really impactful offensively, even as his role is reduced a little bit, as it's inevitably would be with, Scottie kind of being back and at full strength. And it'll be interesting too with Emmanuel quickly, if he can ever get healthy, how everything fits. But, I think to me, it's his level of engagement offensively is really good. And you see his IQ kind of working, as an offensive player. And, really what it kind of comes down to with RJ is how much of that is going to translate into becoming a much more consistent defensive player, because right now he's not consistent enough. And that's been something that's kind of holding him back. And it's something he's going to have to kind of get on top of. Um, to really kind of reach his full potential.
You also wrote about recently about Darko, and it was a really interesting story. And the fan base has kind of been up and down with him. And I think he'd probably admit his first season probably didn't go as well as he'd like, but also the circumstances weren't ideal either. How have you just seen him evolve as a coach, kind of throughout the first season and a half of kind of him being the Raptors coach, and maybe talk a little bit about that story as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's great, to be honest. Like, I think, I'm sure he would acknowledge, and there has been, the Raptors went through that stretch early where they seemed to be in one or two possession games every game and lost a lot of them. And that's always going to come back to the coach a little bit, because the tighter the game, the more any single decision matters. And there were a couple of late games moments and where you kind of could question, and he was questioned about. I personally, in the context of where they're happening, I mean, just a fact. The guy doesn't have 300 NBA games as a head coach under his belt. Like he's got experience as a head coach, but not for 10 or 12 years ago and at a completely different level. He wasn't brought in to be, you know, kind of be a championship level, finals matching wits with, Joe Mazzulla or whoever the coaching Jesus,
Ultra,
Ty
yeah.
Lue, whoever these guys are. Like that wasn't the reason he was hired in this job. Now, I don't think we can know what his chops are going to be like in that environment probably till he gets there. It's probably a bit too early to fully judge. And you don't know actually until you're doing it. So a lot of times, um, so that's all kind of still an open book, still to be determined. But um, and I'm not saying he's been bad in those situations. He's had some good moments too. I just think that in the bigger picture, when you look at what this team is really set out to do, and you look at, the leadership he's shown his coaching staff, the environment he's created for his players, the consistency with which he's kind of carried himself day to day, the fact that you have a guy like Davion Mitchell who's in a contract year, who's in his fourth year and is losing minutes to Jamal Shad, and he can come out and say, like Darko told me exactly what was up. I respected him for doing it, and
Hmm.
he's, I re and kind of no bitterness whatsoever. I mean, I think that says a lot about the head coach. I think the fact you can have a guy like RJ Barrett, and he said like there's no, Darko is a really really nice person, but as RJ would say, like he gets in my shit. Like he's got the ability to be direct and demanding of his players. And so you just kind of hear these experiences over and over, these stories over and over. Um, so, I think to be in a situation where you've lost the amount of games that these guys have lost in a short period of time and still have, I think, a hard playing, cohesive unit you got to give credit to somebody, and I think him and his staff, I think, deserve it at this point in time.
I will say, as a, to put on from my journalism hat to my psychotherapy hat, to try to manage a bunch of millionaires in the NBA, not an easy proposition. So I think, as you mentioned, like they clearly play hard for him, and they haven't been doing a lot of winning, and yet they now won, what is it, 6 of 7? So says a lot about a coach by keeping them. And I also do like the chain after wins. I don't know. It's a pretty good one. I just want to maybe quickly kind of talk about Scottie Barnes. Just I feel like I'm kind of required to. How would you just assess his kind of this season for him? Seems like he's still been pretty good, pretty effective. Definitely taken on more of a leadership role. Has the outlook of maybe his ceiling changed at all this season for you? Kind of after having that All-Star season last year in his third season.
Um, Yeah, I think he's had a good year. I think he's played, he had a bit of a rough patch. He had some ankle problems. He broke his face. He missed some time. Had a pretty bad ankle sprain and probably should have missed more time than he did. And if you look at his sort of season, that was kind of his low point. He had probably a week or 10 days there when he was planning to play through an ankle. And I think there might have been another injury where, he just was not very good. And it, I think they probably should have kept him out longer. But since he's come back from that and been healthy, he's had a nice run here. He's probably played 17 straight games, which has been his longest stretch since going back to before his hand injury at the end of last season. And he's played his best basketball. And I think it's, in terms of his ceiling, I think it's reasonable to still wonder what it is because, I do think that there's still some more he can grow as an offensive player. I think there's still quite a bit more he can grow as an offensive player, and he's starting to show some signs as kind of developing a mid-range uh, package, I guess the way you
Mhm.
could put it, that is pretty essential if you're going to score late in games, late in clocks against good defenders as a primary option. Like, you're just not going to get clean to the basket all the time. You're not going to you're going to get chased off the line. You're going to have people in your jersey basically. So to be able to turn some of those 6 seconds on the clock, fourth quarter, 5-point game possessions into buckets is critical. That's what the best players do. And he's kind of showing a little bit of that. And that's, I think, a big step. And then I think for him to really find his ceiling, I'm not prepared to say he's not going to be a good shooter yet. Like I think he's made enough strides to go, okay, I'm still going to let this play out a little bit. But right now he's shooting on like what 28% from three, and that's been the norm more than an aberration. And I think if you can be a great player in this league and not be a great 3-point shooter, but it does sort of change the geometry a little bit. Um, but I think his on-ball defense is improving. I think, and it's a kind of this very subtle thing to measure, but just the way he carries himself as a public face of the team has improved, I think, significantly.
Hmm.
He's made an effort to gain some training and kind of the fact that he's recognizing that, if you're gonna be a $250 million player and you're the number one asset, so to speak, of a multi-billion-dollar sports team, well, you might want to be able to understand that being comfortable speaking on behalf of that team in difficult circumstances is part of the job. And so it's not the most important part of the job. It's like it's down the list, but the fact that he took it seriously enough to make the effort to get
Hmm.
better, I think is that's more telling to me than the fact he's doing it.
Hmm. Before I let you go, and thanks so much for taking the time and doing this, Grange. I guess I just want to ask you a little bit about Canada basketball because that's kind of how we connected,
Hmm.
and it was a tough summer, especially that quarterfinal game that I think whenever I get a nightmare, it's probably from that game and thinking about Yabusele just bodying everyone in front of the basket. But I guess just what's next for the men's program specifically? Obviously, the World Cup's in 2027 for qualification for the LA Olympics in 2028. But what do you see as like kind of the pathway forward for this program with which NBA players are going to be there? Some have committed, of course, but just maybe your general thoughts on the men's program.
Well, I think everybody is looking forward to a year off, at least. I mean that it's been there's been a lot of intensity and a lot of energy required from the Worlds in 2023 and the Olympics in 2024, and and I think for the people that they're relying and leaning on the most, that the summer of 2025. I don't think there's going to be anything to do with Canada basketball, and maybe a slow ramp up in 2026. I presume there'll be I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I
Yeah.
guess you have the World Cup windows kind of start popping up. So maybe there'll be some mini camps in there, and Shea Gilgeous-Alexander can play against Dominican Republic or something in Hamilton, and you know, um, but um, I think big picture, you look at the core of wings on this team, they're all still going to be pretty much in their prime, 2027 and 2028. That's going to be the strength of this team going forward. And then to me, the real question mark is your big men depth, which was, barely there, I think, in Paris. When you look at Kelly and Dwight, and Kem Birch, competent players, all of them, but they weren't like the backbone of that team. They're all 4 years older, which I think each of them puts each of them like it's like every big man Canada had was born in like 1991 or something. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And so they're all kind of 36, 37. I'm not saying none of them will play. I'm not saying any of them will play, but it's, you can't go into an Olympics or a World Cup, World Championships, uh, relying on, 37-year-old guys. So really the number one question is, you know, will Zach Edey be available and will he be capable? And I think if the answer to both those questions is yes, and I certainly would say on the latter, it's probably going to be yes. Um, then, and certainly Zach's shown all the interest to be part of
Yeah.
the program, then, I think Canada's going to be as well positioned going into LA as they were going into Paris. The challenge is going to be the field just keeps getting better, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, France is going to be awesome. The USA is going to be awesome. All the European nations always seem to keep being competitive. So, nobody's going to hand you a gold medal. So um, I think, but I do say if you look at the grand scope of Canadian basketball, if 2024 wasn't their best chance, then 2028 might be. And,
Hmm.
you'd love to get out of one of these two Olympic cycles with a medal.
I guess with that, obviously Shea's having, an MVP type season. It seems he's the odds-on favorite right now. You remember the Steve Nash days, and I'm not going to ask you, which is better all time, but like, do you think at one point we'll say Shea is the best Canadian basketball player of all time? Like, does it feels like it might be on that trajectory, but I wasn't around to really watch prime Steve Nash, so I feel like you're the better arbitrator
Mhm.
than I am. But
Yeah, I mean, I think we will say that. The challenge is it's going to be really hard to win an MVP, let alone two MVPs, and that's always going to be something that Steve Nash. Who knows? I mean, I do agree. I think Shea's in a good position to win one this year, and I'm not going to put any ceilings or limits on the guy, but it's just hard to do. And so that's always going to have to be something Steve has, I think. But you look at Shea at 26, and um, in total, I think he's a more accomplished, effective all-around player than Steve was at his peak, which is yeah, it's really saying something.
yeah,
Like, don't like I mean, and I say this, Steve is kind of weighed in on this. It's not like he's
no.
not trying to say it's me, not him. I mean, I think he's as big a Shea fan as anybody. He was the guy who put him on the national team when he was like 16 years old. So, I think that's just where it's going. I mean, Shea's 26. He's plays a game. He's incredibly athletic, but his athleticism is kind of a feature among many of what makes him effective. And so I think that to me suggests that he's going to be one of these guys he's going to have a long prime. Like I don't see
Hmm.
him at, you know, 31 all of a sudden looking really creaky and slow. I think he's I think it's going to be so I think the level he's playing at now is going to be kind of within sort of 10% the level he's going to be at it for a long time. And so let's just say at 32 he's still a guy who's an all-star level player, who's still an all NBA level player, like the true greats are, right? Like that's
Hmm.
what's really sets them apart. Then all of a sudden you're looking at a 10-year window from age 24 to
30.
30, 33. That's 10 years, where he could probably have 8 or 9 All NBAs. He could have one, maybe two MVPs. He could have, sorry, that's my wife calling. He could have, and I think OKC, as we all know, is very well positioned to be an elite team for multiple years. So
Hmm.
he could have one and maybe more NBA titles. So you put
Yeah.
all that in a package. I mean, you're he's trending not just to be the best Canadian of all time, like he's going to be a guy who's probably going to start being on your all-time top 50 lists and things like
Mm.
that. So
Yeah,
he's we're lucky to have him.
very lucky. Thanks so much, Grange, for taking the time and doing this. Is there anything kind of upcoming, like at Sportsnet, that you want to plug or anything kind of?
Mhm. No, I mean just the the Raptors delight, the four-part documentary on the 30th anniversary of the franchise. Episode one has already been out. Episode two is coming Wednesday night, as we're speaking now. And I've had a role in helping put some of that stuff together, and there's more to come. And the product, I've had a small role. Like there's a team of features producers who have done just incredible work and lifting. But I think it's I think if you're a basketball person, it's probably worth watching.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time. I'm definitely gonna watch that, and I love your work as always. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, and hopefully, if I put my as a fan, I guess, I hope you get to cover Cooper Flag next year. That's what I want for you, Grange, in 2025. But thanks so much for taking the time and doing this, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. Take care.